All right, I'll begin. Greg and I are old friends. We met through the band formerly known as the Rock Bottom Remainders. Greg is a serious and excellent musician. I am not. And I am there to prove that the people like Greg don't really take themselves seriously as far as the band is concerned. And there are a couple things you should know about Greg. And I tell you this for two reasons. One is so that you know that he's a person of his word and of great honor. The other is if he makes an instant disappearance, you will understand why, and that is that his wife Caroline is about 2 weeks away from her due date, so it'll be Caroline's first child. And Dave Barry was asking me kind of nervously last night, have you seen Greg? Have you seen Greg? And I said, no, I haven't seen him yet, but I know Greg, he'll be here. And he says, well, they're about to have a baby. And I said, yeah, I know. My wife Adrian and Caroline stay in ready contact. And Dave, in his usual Dave way, says, yeah, he says, it's hard to get out of that. So, but the other reason I say it is if he does make an instant disappearance, anybody with a private jet, please come forward. So
this is Palm Springs. Somebody's got a jet out there.
Right. But we have had over the years a lot of conversations about writing, and I thought this morning we would sort of invite all of you into that private conversation, but I know before we go in that direction, Greg wanted to get a word in edgewise, so I will let him. I'm a trial lawyer by training, so I always speak as if I'm being paid by the word. But
I want to tell how I met Scott briefly. You wonder, people ask you in your career when you felt like you made it. Is it when you got an agent? Is it when you sold your first novel? Is it when you first made the bestseller list? It was none of those moments for me, okay? Here's the moment when I felt like I made it. I was on about my fifth book, and I'd made the list and come from nowhere out of Mississippi and all that. And I walk out to my mailbox one day, and there's a letter, and I think it's a bill or something, and I open it up, and it is a fan letter from Stephen King. And I started shaking, okay? I just couldn't. And so shortly after that, I get invited to come to New York and sit in with the Rock Bottom Remainders, this mythical, legendary band I had seen about 3 years before in Miami. And I'll skip all that, getting up there and playing with them that night. But Scott, who was one of my heroes at the time, I felt like Scott walked the line between literary and commercial fiction better than anybody since John le Carré, really. And so after the show, I'm sitting there and somebody goes, oh, that was great, man, that was great. Are you going to the after party at Amy's Loft? And I said, I don't know, I haven't heard anything about it. So I find myself on the street walking to Amy Tan's loft in the Village. I get there, and it's what you imagine. That's the way publishing really is not now, but at Amy's Loft it is. And I get there, and there are all these luminaries, and I drink way too much wine. And within 30 minutes, I've cornered Scott, and I have him in the corner, and I'm asking him if the affair Rusty Savage had in Presumed Innocent is something he really did. And I'm like, I have made it. This is where I wanted to be. Anyway, okay, let's get to writing.
Right, and of course the woman that I was going out with at the time is standing right next to me, eagerly awaiting the answer, so... So, one of the things that I have learned in the band, Dave Barry's kind of the leader of the band, and whenever we start talking shop, Dave comes rushing back to shut us up because he doesn't want anything like serious intentions to get in the way of the effort to make music. But every now and then we escape Dave's intention and talk about writing anyway. And one of the things I have learned over the years in having these conversations with people who are all good friends is that there are no rules about how books get made, and that every author has his or her own process. And a lot of that, a lot of those differences go back to the beginning. So I wanted to ask Greg, accepting the extraordinary role that luck plays for all of us, how did you become a writer, and how did you become a successful writer?
I'm going to try to be brief with that. That's a good question. But Scott and I had very different paths. We once, I think at Stanford or somewhere, we discussed this on stage, whether writers are born or made. And I fall on the born side. And the reason is, I think everything I needed to learn to be a writer, I learned by the time I was in the 9th grade, maybe the 6th grade, okay? And here's why I say this. So many people think they can sit down and write a novel like they do something else. Particularly lawyers tend to think that in the wake of Scott or Grisham. You know, they think, oh, I can do better than that, and then they find out the truth. But writing is not about command of the English language, okay? Command of the English language is a hammer. It's just a tool. Writing is about voice, and this is the analogy I would use. If I tell you, if Scott told us he can sing, which he won't tell us, but if he told us that, how long would he have to sing for you guys to know whether he could sing or not?
Know the truth.
4 seconds? 3 seconds? Let me tell you, writing is exactly the same way. If you guys say I've written a novel, I can read one page and I will know if you can write or not. You know, beginners, they don't ever want to send the query letter in 3 chapters. They think, how could they possibly judge my talent? You'll be lucky if they read more than a page, okay? So writing was just something that I could do, and I'd never really especially wanted to do it. I wanted to play music. That's a lot more fun. Getting up on stage, it's like an infinite opiate neuroreceptor loop coming at you. And the remainders, women are throwing geriatric panties, you know. Writing is sitting in a room by yourself alone for a year, 2 years, 3 years, no feedback. And so I don't want to take up the time with the road to success or whatever, but basically when I was 29 and married, and my wife at the time was in dental school, I was on the road 50 weeks out of 52 playing music. And I said, you know, this isn't going to work right here. So I gave myself 1 year to write a novel. When I was halfway through, I sold it and made the New York Times bestseller list, and I never looked back. And I think that's luck. In fact, it's the worst novel I've ever written. So it's luck, but also what I find is the people I meet, like Scott, or people who really make it and have some longevity in general, not without exception, but in general, those people were just have a fantastic amount of talent, and they have a voice that came from their parents, their young teachers, the people. And anyway, I'll stop there, Scott, and you go to your side.
Right. Well, my side is, as Greg said to start, it's a different story. I have to say Greg's observation that every lawyer thinks that, you know, she or he is especially trial lawyers, they think they're really born to be great novelists, and they're just making a stop along the way. And the best story I've got about that is I was sitting in my law office one day, and the phone rings, and a guy introduces himself as a lawyer from Miami, and he says, well, you know, I'm thinking about writing this novel. And I stop him. I say, you know, my lawyers have told me don't listen to somebody else's story. I did. No, he says, I don't want to know that. And he starts again about the novel, and I'm just like, you know, and I don't really give writing advice, you know, over the phone. No, he says, what I need to know from you is, once I write this novel, how do I sell the movie rights? And so it is certainly true about the presumptuousness of many lawyers, and I can't tell you how many of my law partners have bootlegged me copies of the novels that they have written, and in most cases it is, as Greg says, one page lets you know whether this is going to be a pleasure, which has happened in one case, or it's going to be a slog before you, and it's hard to tell at that point what's worse, having to read the book or having to deliver the news that it was hard to read the book, but I go ahead with it. So I come from the full-on other side of the spectrum. When I was about 11 years old, I decided that I wanted to be a novelist. And there were a number of influences on this decision. For one thing, that was my mom's ambition. She wanted to be a novelist, and she never really got herself underway. My mom was like a lot of people who had a great deal of talent and could have done a lot of different things, but she just really never got herself fully motivated to harness it. But she loved literature. We talked about books all the time. I adored her. She was a wonderful mother. And I took on her ambition, and I read The Count of Monte Cristo. I was one of those kids who really hated to go to school. Because I was a very dreamy kid and didn't pay attention and always, and something's in my head, and I turn around and talk to the kid next to me, and the teacher gets angry, and I'm always getting, the Chicago public schools in those days, they used to give you a check mark if your deportment needed improvement, and for talking in class, the box was called keeps profitably busy. And according to my teachers, I never kept profitably busy. That went on for the 8 years that I spent in the Chicago public schools. I got check marks every quarter. So I didn't like to go to school because I just was never with the program. And I feigned all kinds of illnesses. And my mom, who was a former teacher, sometimes she let me get away with it, sometimes she didn't. But if she let me stay home, she was smart enough to insist that I do something profitable with the time. And so she handed me The Count of Monte Cristo and said, she was a former French major, and she said, I think you'll like this book. Well, I loved it. And from that, I took the notion that if it was that exciting to read a book, how much more exciting would it be to have written that book? And feel the story come to life inside you. Now, I would say parenthetically that I know a lot of writers who would tell you it isn't exciting at all. It's agony. I don't write that way. I don't find writing to be painful at all. For me, it is a joy. But one of the reasons that it is a joy is because I spent so many years struggling with the craft, learning to attach thoughts and feelings to words. And, and the truth of the matter, by the way, just if we're doing a survey, is that there are more people who fall on my side of the divide than fall on Greg's. In other words, most successful writers are made in the sense that whatever natural talents they have to be honed. Amy Tan, like Greg, had very quick success once she started writing. But just looking at the band as a survey of successful writers, most of us spent years trying to learn how to do it in different ways. So my path, I wrote in high school as a high school newspaper editor. I went to college. I went to little college in Massachusetts, Amherst College. I fell in love with the way the place looked, and I applied. I got in, and of course it'll tell you the kind of diligent 17-year-old I was, that once I got there I was shocked when it turned out there were no creative writing classes. And so the only answer I could find was, to write. And I spent the summer after my first year in college writing a novel. And again, I would say to anybody in this room who wants to be a writer, and this is one thing you will take from both of our stories, that I once got a letter from Phil Knight, who's the founder of Nike, and I told him that he had stolen the writer's slogan, which is "Just do it." Whether you have a formed voice, as Greg did, or you're like me and need to work at it a little bit, you will never find it unless you put your rear end in the chair and start writing. And it is, great writers don't sit in bars talking about writing. They don't just hang out with writers. They write. And anybody who writes is a writer, and anybody who doesn't isn't. And it's just that simple. For me, the real key was not just voice, though, which I agree with Greg. My voice, while it may not have been there intuitively or instantly, it pretty well formed after I'd spent 5 years after college at Stanford in the writing program there, first as a fellow and then as a teacher in that program. So I had the voice, but still the other thing that young people frequently lack is something to write about that other people are interested in reading. And I had started on this academic career, and I made one really important realization. I was talking with Greg Burns about this yesterday, which is that I realized at the age of roughly 25 that I didn't want to be an academic. I did not want to be an English professor. I was blundering down that path because writers are always looking for ways to support themselves. And teaching is always an obvious alternative. And I realized that even though I admired my colleagues in the Stanford English department, I was not going to be as good at this as they were. And what I was really interested in was law. This was a great shock to me. My father was a physician. I always say my dad was a prophet in his own time, in the sense that he was a doctor who hated lawyers long before it was common for doctors to do that. And so I didn't know any lawyers because my dad wouldn't let them in the house. And when my college roommates all went off to law school, I was astonished at how interesting I found what they were doing. And the same thing happened while I was out at Stanford. I made dear friends in the writing program who have been my friends for life. But the other people that I tended to become friendly with were lawyers, who were almost all of them working in the public sector in one way or another. Public defenders, guy who was the constitutional lawyer for the city of San Francisco. And although I was doing well in my academic career and had an opportunity to take a tenure-track job, I had this startling realization that I would rather be a lawyer. Now, the problem with being a lawyer, of course, is that there was a saying, a sexist term that you don't hear much anymore, which is that the law is a jealous mistress. And what that means is lawyers work really hard, and which has proven to be true, and that there's not a lot of time to write. But I went to law school committing myself that I would continue to write somehow. And that's basically what I did. I wrote on the morning commuter train. I had a wonderful job as an assistant U.S. attorney. My guess about myself that I wanted to be a lawyer was completely correct. I was very involved, as my writing has shown, with crime. And so it was all natural to me. I had a subject now in writing about the law. I wrote a book about being in law school called 1L that's still in print. And then I spent 8 years while I was a young prosecutor working on Presumed Innocent. And that, of course, after having written 4 or 5 unpublished novels, all of a sudden I got struck by lightning. And I was an instant success after 20 years of writing. So that's how it happened for me, a much different story than Greg's. So as you can probably tell from Greg's story, though, a person who can say, well, I gave myself 1 year to write a novel, is somebody who just sort of boils with the force of a story and what he wants to say. And but tell us how a book comes to life for you.
Before we get to that, I realize we have more in common even than I knew, Scott. I never talk about this at these things, but I am for a second. It's one thing to say you're a natural talent or you didn't learn. I came from Mississippi, where in my generation, you grew up to either be a doctor or a lawyer, or you worked at the factory down the road. The idea of nobody that I knew had been a writer in Mississippi since William Faulkner. It wasn't something you could aspire to, okay? My mother was a teacher and a librarian. My father was a doctor. But my mother grew up on a subsistence farm in Louisiana and had no electricity till she was 14. When she went to college, she didn't know what a piece of china was, but a librarian gave her a list of 100 books she needed to read to succeed in college. She read all 100 books before she went, and she graduated first in her class, became a teacher. My dad was almost as poor, became a physician. He is the doctor in my trilogy, really. But the thing he revered above all was books. He spent his whole life he's passed away now, probably the finest library in the state of Mississippi on the Civil War and Mississippi history, but philosophy and everything else. And I grew up in that library, okay? So by the time I got to college, I was in the program Willie Morris had at Ole Miss. John Grisham came out of that program. Donna Tartt came out of that program. Several other people. But I did an event with John not long ago, and we both said the same thing. Willie didn't teach us how to write. What he did was he brought in William Styron and James Dickey, Winston Groom, people like that. And we did hang out in the bar. I got to watch Deliverance in a tiny little theater with James Dickey telling me how he wrote the movie and made it, and then drink beer with him, you know? And what that did was told me and John, wow, this is a pretty cool way you can make money doing this. They'll pay you to do this, right? And suddenly this door is just cracked open, and if you have that potentiality within you, man, you just charge through it, because the alternative is grim. You know, it's real life. Anyway, I just wanted to get that in.
I have to interrupt and tell one story about my physician father, who, my dad was a very bright man, like Greg's dad, and one of the things that impressed me when I finally read his letters from World War II was what a beautiful writer he was. This is not something I knew about my dad, because he really, unlike Greg's father, was not involved with books. And when I started writing, I was, of course, conscious of the fact that my dad didn't really seem very interested in what I was writing. And I published this book about law school 1L. I'm not positive he read it. But finally, when Presumed Innocent came out, and there was, great success, I was aware that I saw my father open this book. And finally he came up to me, and I'd gone to visit my parents one day, and he said, I read your novel. I said, okay, and tell me, what did you think? He says, I still think you could have gone to medical school. So, but anyway, back to Greg, and just tell us. And I'm a great fan of the last 3 books that Greg has published. I'll refer to them as, I think it's called the Natchez Burning Trilogy,
whatever,
but I call it the Natchez Trilogy as I think about it, even though so many of Greg's books are set in Natchez. But tell us how something like that comes into being.
Okay, I'll do this real quick. I normally work one way, but the trilogy was different. I started writing the trilogy, which deals with some real-life civil rights murders, fictionalized, and I was naive enough to think that we were living under Barack Obama and people were talking about a post-racial society, and I thought I was working on the most irrelevant possible book in the world. And then, then America went crazy. America became Mississippi all of a sudden. But I pulled out onto the highway, when I was coming to the end of what I thought would be one volume, which later became 2,300 pages, 3 books. And a truck hit my driver's door going 70 miles an hour. Took my leg off, tore my aorta, broke, like Steve, who's in the band, almost killed me. And I woke up out of a coma a week later. And that really altered the way I had worked up to then in my life. I went on a quest, lost my publisher, lost my agent, and I said, I'm going to write the truth about race in America and Mississippi, and damn the consequences, I don't really care. But before that, this is the part where Scott and I differ, and this is the interesting part if you're a writer. Here's what I do. I spend most of the year lying to my publisher, not working. I just coach my kids' little league, play music, bush hog the grass, whatever it is I'm doing. And the story is in there. And stories are generated many ways. Stephen King jokes on the bus. So, Greg, where do you get your ideas? That's what we get asked everywhere we go. You can't explain that.
By the way, Steve does have an answer to that question because he's asked all the time, and he strokes his chin and he says, where do I get my ideas? Schenectady. So.
Oh my God. So what I do is that thing is working all the time within me. And this sounds pretentious, but it's sort of like a Jungian process. You've got all these archetypes of the characters. You have the idea of what the story is, and it's working by itself. And Steve gave the best analogy in the world in his book on writing. He said, every writer's mind is like a house, and the subconscious is the basement of the house. And down in the basement are all these boxes that are unlabeled. And the stupidest thing you can do as a writer is go down there in that basement and start trying to sort out those boxes, because there's already a crew down there working on those boxes, and your job is to stay the hell out of the way. And I learned that before I met Steve, thank God, right? So here's what happens. You're going along, you're coaching Little League, I'm recording a song in my studio, and I compare, it's like a pregnant woman when her water breaks. That story's coming. I run to my recliner where I have this big setup. I have these monitors and a hospital table. I get out my ice cold tab and my granola bars, and I start working in about 12 hours straight at a time. At the end, I work 24 and 36 hours at a time. I barely ever change a word. And my average book length is 185,000 words. The trilogy average length, the books are 250,000. Okay? I'm insane. I do not recommend this way to write, but it does work. And I think the reason it works is, it's like old Orson Welles. You remember those wine commercials? We'll sell no wine before it's time. You let that story happen enough, and man, it's like you're taking dictation. You can't even type fast enough to get it down. And the immediacy of it is so strong because it's like you're living it as it goes on the page, you know? To me, and that's just my way. So I'll draw a line right there. But
So I as I said, have a method that is probably more like Greg's than some others. Our dear mutual friend Ridley Pearson, for example, Ridley can't put a word on the page before he's got a complete outline, which I find unimaginable. Sue Grafton, may she rest in peace, could not go on to chapter 2 until she had finished chapter 1 and felt that it was word perfect. So my method is somewhat like Greg's, and in some ways not at all like Greg's. My teacher when I was at Stanford was Wally Stegner. And it's funny, it's really funny what sticks with you over the years. And Wally was a great believer in the notion that novels get written by sticking your butt in a chair every day, and that you can't kid yourself. It's a job like every other job, and you have to do it every day. More writers I know are in the Stegner school than are in the Iles school. But again, I go back to what I said to start. no rules. The proof is in the pudding at the end of the day. But what a terrible mixed metaphor that was. But and Wally used to say, okay, I write 2 pages every day of the year except Christmas. And at the end of the year, I've got 730 pages. And in that, there's got to be something worth saving. Now, I can't write that way. I can't say, you got to write 2 pages, because that's the sort of discipline that I hated in grade school, and I won't do it to myself. But I do think there's great value in keeping the machinery oiled and continuing to write once I get started. And a lot of this was born of necessity, because as I said, when I became an AUSA, I had a young family, I had this 16-hour-a-day job. There wasn't much time to write, and the only time I could find was in the morning commuter train from the suburbs to downtown Chicago, and I would write in 30-minute bursts. And with only 30 minutes a day to write, it was not worth trying to pick up in sequence what had happened before. I had to write from feeling, and I don't keep a diary. So this is where Greg and I are sort of alike. I used to say I write from inspiration, meaning that I've got an idea about something, something happened yesterday, I can imagine that it's relevant to my character. It could be a patch of conversation, it could be an incident in the courtroom, it could be a thought about life, an observation of a character. Whatever it is, though, it has a grip on me, and I write it down. And that's still the way I write. And I will, in the early stages of a book, as I'm sort of feeling my way around the world that I hope to create, that's what I will do. I will write. Sometimes it's only half an hour. Sometimes half an hour turns into 2 hours. Again, I make no rules about it, because very much, as Greg is saying, I have learned over the years to trust the process. I'm much too anxious a person to have understood this when I was younger, that I don't need to beat myself over the head. It will happen. But my way of sort of keeping the faith is to put on the page stuff that I think is going to be worthwhile. And if I were to guess, about 20% of what I write in that first year actually finds its way into the novel that I'm going to write. But it doesn't matter, because I am learning the characters, I am learning the world, I am understanding, the rules of gravity in that particular universe. And that's what I do. My usual standard has been, a year of what I call wandering around inside the book, a year to write the next, to put that together into a draft, and then probably 6-8 months working with an editor to bring that to a publishable form. Unlike Greg, I revise constantly, because one of my ways to get myself going when I'm not gripped by some great idea is to read something that I've written before. Always I will want to change it, and so I will take off from that spot, and it begins by editing it and perfecting it, and not with a lot of conscious thought about syntax or grammar, but just getting involved in what I've written, feeling what I felt before, and trying to make it more perfect. And eventually, as I said, that I glue those pieces together. I wouldn't be sitting here if the personal computer hadn't been invented, because it allows me to take all of these disparate things and put them in order and figure out where they go in the book. And then that's a draft, and then from the draft there becomes a final book. But as I said, a radically different process than...
You said something interesting, Scott, that we have both written standalone novels and what you might call a series novel, and that Scott writing about Kendall County, you could call that a series. I embarrassed myself at a conference like this, or I felt bad. I was up with 2 or 3 writers, 2 of whom wrote series. I wasn't that aware, and I sort of arrogantly was dismissing the idea of series, because to me, too many series are sort of a lazy man's way of producing books. To me, as a young writer, it was always about dealing with that character and that universe you're talking about in the watershed moment of their life, going completely down to the DNA and doing the entire arc and wringing everything out of it and never going back. And to me, a series was just, okay, I'm going to rack another 100, whatever in the bank and go on. It was easy. But as I've aged, and my Pen Cage books started in 1998, and I took about 7 years between them and did 3. I never intended to do more than 1. And then with the trilogy, I did 3. Suddenly...
They're 5 or 6 now, right?
Yeah, they're 6 now. So now I realize that in what you were talking about, going into the universe, figuring it all out, the topography of it, the emotional topography, all of it, you can do more things in a series. You can go deeper, really, than you can in a novel. And the analogy would be what is happening in cable TV. The feature film is so limited, except the most genius examples, compared to what you can do in 10 or 20 hours of television in terms of character exploration. So I've sort of changed, and I think you did the same thing. You've written these standalone novels, and you go to Kendall County, and it's like, I've got to admit now as I get older, to start writing in that universe you know so well is such a relief, because other than that, you're building it from the first stone up. You're creating an entire universe with a standalone, and that maybe gets harder, I've found, as I get older.
Yeah, I think some of this comes from coming to terms with the writer who you are. And when I was in my youth, I had read Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and I thought I wanted to be James Joyce. And, eventually I read Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and decided that I wasn't sure I wanted to be James Joyce. I didn't think I wanted to write anything that was that difficult to read, to be honest. But I still wanted to write something that seemed that elevated and transporting and, rarefied and spectacular. And of course, as you get older, at least for me, as I got older and found my voice, although ironically we were both probably around the same age when that began to happen, which is 29, I was both, as I said before, I found tremendous joy in having that voice, understanding my own way of expressing myself, knowing when I begin a paragraph instinctively where it's going, and that it's going to just in that minute way actually take the reader someplace from beginning to end. And that's wonderful. But the other side of it, of course, is that you have to come to terms with who you are. And I remember I got stuck after my first 2 novels, and I went on what I thought was a kind of detour, and I wrote a novel called Pleading Guilty that I think of as a comic novel. And my agent called my wonderful Italian editor, Giancarlo Bonacina, who, again, like too many people at this stage of life, may rest in peace. And she said to Bonacina, well, how would you feel if Scott was writing a very different kind of book? And Bonacina's response was, oh, no author really writes a different kind of book. They all write the same book. And this is something that, Hemingway and Graham Greene have all agreed on, that there's, certain overarching concerns that if a writer has keyed into what really moves him or her, it's going to be repeated. There's a sort of there's a kind of mortality in that, in knowing what your own limits are, and there's a kind of pleasure in it, in having found your own voice. You want to add to that?
I agree with all of that. I've written in a lot of different genres, but I agree the overarching concern is usually the same. I've been concerned with the nature of evil and why good people do bad things, and that no one is truly either or, that the line between good and evil runs right down the middle of the human heart. Even though I've written about everything from the Holocaust to childhood sexual abuse to artificial intelligence to the South, you have your concerns, and that's what you mine. What you said about beginning a paragraph and knowing where it's going, when we were talking about voice, I should have said this earlier. Here's how I recognize talent in that voice. When I'm reading a sentence, jealousy is always a good clue when you feel jealous when you read something. But I may not, I read that first paragraph or second paragraph, I may not know where that writer is going and where the story is going, but I know he or she knows where the story's going, and I feel comfortable in their hands, man. That's the magic right there. Mm-hmm. If somebody has that, they're a writer, you know?
So we have literally 2 minutes and 15 seconds left. Do you want to take 1 minute apiece to talk about Hollywood? Because this, of course, is the great, I wouldn't call it the bugaboo, but it comes with success as a novelist, which is that sooner or later somebody shows up and wants to make a film out of something that you've written. And the problem is one that Greg already touched upon, which is that when I arrived on the set of Presumed Innocent, Brian Dennehy, who became a dear friend, said to me, he says, if we filmed everything in your novel, it would take about 14 hours, and we don't have 14 hours. So you're always dealing with the process of abridgment, and you're always dealing with the fact that the movie is running from the outside, showing you characters, and the audience is intuiting their responses from what they're seeing on their faces, versus the novel, which is coming from the inside. And so there is that disconnect between the two crafts, and coming to terms with it is something we can take another hour on later. But go ahead.
But you and I have both written first-person present, and we write very internalized novels, and that's the hardest thing to film, because the readers love the book precisely because of the internal dialogue that presents the greatest challenge to get on the screen. And it's frustrating, and it makes those kind of novels particularly not suited to a 90-minute feature film. Now, the new format of cable TV opens that up greatly, but we got 30 seconds. I'm not even going there. Let's just you finish. You close it out.
Well, I think, as I said to start, you can take from this morning the one great lesson, which is there are no rules except find the voice, hold on to it, know who you are, and know where you're going, in the sense that the voice will take you there. So thank you all for being here.